Hi everyone, Puka here. We recorded a couple episodes with Terry Robinson of Mage the podcast before his passing in December that we will be sharing in tandem with that show. We'd like to thank his loved ones for their encouragement in collecting and offering the glamour of his words into the world. This episode, to start the new season, is also a co-production with Werewolf the podcast, and although we tried to come up with a good name for this unholy podcasting conglomeration, ultimately we just kind of started talking. Anyway, hope you enjoy our read-through, and with that, here come the words and music.
This is Changeling the podcast.
Hi, Mage fans. Welcome to Various Podcasts. Joining me today on the World of Darkness Network, or also known as the FU Vampire the Masquerade Network, is Josh Heath of Werewolf the podcast. Say hi, Josh.
Hi, everyone. Oh, I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything else, but I'm Josh Heath of Werewolf the podcast and other amazing podcasts, except for mostly Werewolf the podcast. You might know me from there.
And Opcast.
And Opcast, Arms Around the Trinity Continuum, which is much more exciting for me.
That's like the once in a while that I'm identified as being associated with systematic understanding of everything. And I'm just like, no, that's not what you should know me from. Also joining us is Puka from Changeling the podcast. Puka, how you doing?
I'm just peachy. I have a lot of coffee in front of me, which helps. With
Not in
things.
you, in front of you.
It's getting there. Give it time.
And finally, the person whose technology platform we are using to do this because it took us 3 other tries. Also, Josh from Changeling the podcast. How are you doing, other Josh?
I'm doing okay. Tired this morning, not sure why.
Would you like some coffee?
Sure.
I'm a cold caffeine person versus a hot caffeine person. All of them are fine, But we're here today to talk about 2 supplements where we have an overwhelming amount of ignorance to bring to the topic, which is World of Darkness Tokyo and possibly World of Darkness Hong Kong, depending on how quickly we get through things. We all looked at these books and said, I guess there's something here we could talk about. So we're going to start with World of Darkness Tokyo, which I entitled, If at First You Don't Succeed, Commit Seppuku.
No.
Also, alternatively, World of Darkness Tokyo, Arite 6 is about average. Or World of Darkness Tokyo, Ghosts and Uedo Garden, basically. Why are we complicating things? The opening story is a ghost in the Jade Kingdom waiting to get revenge on the cop that killed his brother. They serve on a renegade ship and then goes to kill him. And the entire time, his shadow is like mocking him, being like, you want to kill someone? You're going to kill someone like a bitch. And I think we all came away with the impression where it's like, wait, what? Who's the good guy in this part? The Shadow or the Wraith? And then we get an introduction that the author indicates this is the first Wraith book that they have acted as the developer for, and a statement that the errors are their own, which is interesting because they didn't write the book. So that's an odd position. Did anyone have thoughts on the ghost story Vengeance, My Love, or the introduction?
It was so Wraith.
Yeah.
Just so Wraith.
Yeah, the shadow, like we were debating, is this actually a specter? But
As a clarifying question, because I'm not as up on the Wraith timeline, but this was like quite near the end of Wraith, right? So the bit about, I've just become the developer, I was like, well, I hope you like doing one more book.
More or less, yeah. This was seconds before End of Empire would be released. I wouldn't be surprised if due to like White Wolf Publishing chicanery, this actually came out afterwards or something like this.
Yeah.
Yep. I have a thought on the introduction too, which is a Changeling specific thing. They mention what banality is, despite sticking to the whole Cien from Land of 8 Million Dreams, where that's not relevant, but they like throwing in we'll get to that later. But it's just kind of funny.
But this is a book that is listed as being a Year of the Lotus supplement for Wraith the Oblivion. Regardless of that, it does do what any good city book does and gives you the history, gives you the location, and gives you all the other night folk who are active in it until we get to the final chapter, which reminds us once again so thoroughly that this is a Wraith supplement. But we figured that there was enough material here that interested parties might be curious about what's inside of it and kind of help guide people's buy decisions. That way we can all put our appropriate Drive-Thru-RPG affiliate links in our appropriate show notes. So who would like to start with the Chapter 1 Tokyo's Past?
I'll start with that. So this starts with going through the history like any World of Darkness 90s book. Probably should just read Wikipedia instead, but for the most part, I mean, there's some, and it's not that it's particularly inaccurate. It's confusing though. Like it's talking about you have the various clans or chieftains or something, different rulers who broke things up. And it references they called the Shoin by the chieftains, after name given by lands donated by the emperor to high imperial officials. It does not mention anything to do with an emperor or how emperors fit into it at this point, so I'm a little bit confused how an emperor could have done that. So and it just goes through historical period, archaeological period, I guess, the rise of the Edo region all the way up through the 15th century. It talks about the shogunate period, which I get, more decentralized, but again, a little bit confusing because it never talks about the centralized period very much. And, talks about a little sidebar on Christians and other aliens. Then the 18th century, Japan became more restricted. The Ronin incident, a whole bunch of earthquakes and stuff in the 18th century, more shogunate stuff.
They were really into their shogunates.
Yep, and then their forced opening by U.S., which is where it was sort of the U.S. in 1853 came in and said, hey, you got to start trading now, openly. And that sort of completely upended the political system in Japan. Talks about, does the little bits of supernatural influence in it. Oh, yeah, they say on the sidebar that Commodore Perry's, the U.S. forcing it open, talks about how, the technocracy was involved by having an agent who may not be human, which was confusing. And then talks a lot about Kuijin, which are the Asian different kind of vampires in the World of Darkness. Yeah, and then the emperor, at that point in history, the Japanese emperor consolidated power a lot more and became much more of instead of more of a figurehead, became centralized again, or maybe for the first time, according to this book. There was a deal with the were sharks between them and the vampires, and they feel betrayed in World War II when they originally were together. More earthquakes in Tokyo.
World of Darkness, more earthquakes.
And I mean, this really, any major historical city seems to have a lot of fires and stuff, so this is not it, but the earthquake-based.
It's all that building with wood.
Yeah. And then all the way build up to World War II, through World War II, kind of short, but that's fine, I guess. And then, the only nuclear bombs dropped in wartime. And then the post-war years with heavy American influence, talking about, I don't know how accurate this is or not, maybe, American occupation force actually enlisting the organized crime Yakuza families to fight against communism. It says that here.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe that happened. I don't know. Yeah, and then, going more to Yama Kings, which are demon emperors of the underworld, trying to influence things. And then modern era. Yeah. Like I said, I feel like you could just read Wikipedia and get it better.
Pook, what stood out to you?
Well, I will say, because we are doing Tokyo first, I read Hong Kong first, so I kind of read that history chapter first. And it's interesting to me how little this one leans into the kind of East versus West stereotype in comparison. There is the bit about Commodore Perry, and there's a little bit of that, but the Hong Kong history is then the Western devils came over and over and over. So it was kind of refreshing not to have that.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other thing is that, in the context of what you were saying, Josh, about the emperor and the shogun, there were points where I thought, well, wait, what's the broader Japanese context for this? And then I was like, well, it is just Tokyo. So maybe they felt, oh, we don't have to do World of Darkness Japan. But that would have been really helpful for a reader in the 90s without access to Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's helpful, though, to remember that this book is in context with the other World of Darkness books around it, right? It is a book that the context exists already, right? In Kindred of the East, you get a large segment of information about the history of Japan. And then that to say, all of the history here is just presented as information to make the Wraith stuff make sense in the future, right? The layers of how a Wraith underworld area is built is because of this history, right? So the regions and the buildings and the people that you're going to see are in that context, right? But the history doesn't actually matter here. It is just to give you that context of who are the people who are going to appear in the underworld.
Yeah.
I also wondered, I haven't read Dark Kingdom of Jade, but is there some Wraith-specific history stuff in there that the author assumed would have been read?
Yes, that's the other problem with both of these books when they tie into the Wraith stuff, is that they assume you have read the Dark Kingdom of Jade and the Dark Kingdom of Jade Adventures. Those two books are essential to the context of this particular book in a way that almost makes it useless if you don't have that context.
Yeah. The Year of the Lotus stuff and associated things in general, I found in like Across the World of Darkness, it's like a different game line that still needs a bunch of other game lines, and you kind of had to have read so many books to make sense of a lot of what's in any of them. And that's
like the weird Marvel crossover event of RPGs where it's like, oh, you didn't read Ghost Rider 419, so that's why you don't understand why Machine Man is suddenly fighting Galactus, and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
I'd read that issue.
There's also the kind of weird thing just structurally or something in this chapter. It has I think the only map of Tokyo is in the history chapter for some reason.
That was, I think, an accidental layout. Thing. Terry, I wanted to ask you as well, what do you feel about 14 members of the Cabal of Pure Thought showing up in the 1600s?
That was most, in my world, that is the Cabal of Pure Thought showed up. That was,
and apparently they couldn't get anything done in 250 years.
The literal comment I had, Pook, was the entirety of the Cabal of Pure Thought shows up, fails to spread Christianity, is there for 200 years, and then disappears. So, the things that stood out for me were, one, I always like when a location book plots out, these are contemporaneous cities when this was founded. Like there was that day at which Tokyo was just like a fishing village or something analogous. And with a city that has about 1,500 years of history, its contemporaries would be Chichen Itza, Lhasa, Venice, and Baghdad. Ish. I also like the call out to Millard Fillmore, which I think is the only Millard Fillmore reference we get in the World of Darkness.
Or indeed anywhere.
Yes. We get that the New World Order poisons the Emperor and then strengthens the Gauntlet so his ancestors can't help. I kind of like this as a plot device where it's like, oh, part of the reason why the technocracy is so interested in having the Gauntlet rise is in cultures that have ancestor worship or veneration of ancestors, it kind of cuts them off from that. And that is something that I hadn't kind of considered, where it might cut someone off from their power base and not just like keep out bloodthirsty unicorns and crop destroying Chlorokin or something like that. I also like that they note specifically the period when mustaches become popular, as well as the various factions during World War II, and like ghosts want to extend the war to kind of finish off vendettas. The Nefandi did too, but that never happened, which ties into this weird part in Mage lore, which mentions, oh, by the way, the Nefandi attempting to summon their Dark Lords in Europe was not a failure of magic or because Gruul had awoken and robbed them of their power, but because the Nefandi just assumed that the Pacific War was going to become this giant bloody altercation, and it never did because of the use of nuclear weapons. And that just brings me back to one of my favorite inconsistencies within the Mage line. The more time I spend with Mage, the more certain I am that inconsistency is a gift to the player and the storyteller alike. It also mentions that the technocracy is very aware of the idea of what dragon lines, aka ley lines, aka passive quintessence are, and goes for them very specifically. I would have liked more discussion of the difference between the Western technocracy and the Eastern technocracy, which we'll probably get into a little bit later, but, can't complain. Any other thoughts on the history section before we move on to places?
I think there's one thing that I want to add. The context of the shogun versus the emperor is incredibly important only if you want to understand the power structure of how wraiths themselves might see their allegiance to the Dark Kingdom of Jade and to each other, right? Because Japan has been a fractured country, even with official large head leaders. And that fractiousness is going to be present within your Wraith or even Kuijin, or other groups are going to have those different allegiances. So something to think about, that a united front about external or internal enemies is not going to be a thing based on this history that is present here.
Two other quick things that I noticed. The bit about Well, they say feng shui, but it wouldn't actually be feng shui in Japan. And as you said, the technocracy being aware of dragon lines and stuff, they make a reference to the Zaibatsu and the others playing architectural chess, which I was like, oh, that's so cool. Like just having the proxy for the Ascension War through buildings. So I liked that. And then also when Josh and I recorded on Land of 8 Million Dreams, one of the things that was really aggravating about that book was how little you could kind of integrate it into the Changeling setting. And there's a sidebar here on something called the Tomorrow Garden or the Ashtenua. And it's about the Fae of Japan at some point, almost like doing prophecy bonsai, I guess it would be, to kind of plot out these possible futures and make them come to pass. They talk about connections with the yin dreaming and the yang dreaming, which we never hear about again. And it's so cool. And I'm so annoyed that none of that found its way anywhere else. So that was something throughout the chapter, actually. Like there was Hong Kong history chapter. When we get to that, there was a lot about the customs and the society and the culture, which is not present here. And that was kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I think there's an assumption of understanding the samurai Japan, right?
Yeah.
Or even the modern Japan. And no one can see my air quotes, but like the assumption that people are aware of these things in the West, right?
Yeah. I think their assumption may have been anyone running this or reading this has read enough anime. And they're going, that'll teach you everything you need to know.
Curiously, there's no anime listed in the inspirations in the prologue. So maybe they just assumed that.
I mean, that would be like a book mentioning the American Heritage Dictionary as a useful reference. It's assumed, I think. Any other thoughts, Changeling Josh?
It kept making so many gaps in terms of what it's actually covering. You had to already been familiar with the material to understand it, but it's not like it just presented the supernatural side. Most of it was talking about the moral side. I really don't understand who this was for.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of secret history. I was hoping that we'd get a little bit more of that.
Yeah, if they just only did secret history, expected you understood Japan, cool. But if you don't understand Japan history, this is useless to you too, because it's too many gaps.
It was seemingly from an era before we figured out how to make real world history gameable, like how to write it in such a way that a contemporary player would be able to drop it into their game.
I grew up playing the Sid Meier-DOS game, Sword of the Samurai, and that was perfectly sufficient to understand this.
Speaking of Puka, do you want to walk us through Chapter 2, The City Dissected?
Nay, Terry, we shall run. So yes, Chapter 2, The City Dissected, is about the geography of Tokyo, which it describes as a city in combat with itself. Sure. I apologize for referring continuously back to the Hong Kong book, but let's consider that foreshadowing. Unlike in that book, we don't get sidebars about the Shen, the supernaturals, in each of these locations. That's all kind of in the next chapter. But the various districts. So we start with central Tokyo as the main center of influence for the supernatural population, because that's where most of the hubbub of Tokyo takes place. They call it the convergence of tradition and progress. The subdivisions include the Imperial Palace. This is the closed-off citadel home of the Emperor. It's surrounded by diverted rivers and is a balanced bastion of Qi. The city's Kuei-jin ancestor and Hangoyoke both dwell here, which I guess they kind of get along. I don't know enough about the setting to understand how that works in relation to, like, Kindred and Garou, but okay. Some of the notable places include the East Garden, which is the former castle's center, the Yasukuni Shrine, a controversial monument to the war dead, often with right-wing propaganda being blasted from vans outside, the Tokyo Station Central Transit Hub, and in the vicinity there are things like the Stock Exchange and the Nihonbashi Bridge, which is this historically significant bridge. There's Kasumigaseki District, which concentrates the government buildings, press clubs, and Strike Force Zero, which I haven't read. I know that Mage the podcast has...
Oh, we covered it.
Yeah, I thought
we covered ass tattoos in all of its glorious butt-cheeked glory.
Excellent. The gluteal dragons of Strike Force Zero.
You're like, I see that ley line.
Mm-hmm. So then Ginza is the commercial district and is at the cutting edge of modernity and luxury. There are many, many stores and galleries, mostly upscale, but like avant-garde and traditional stuff mixed in. Then you have Yorokocho, which is the red light district and black market district. Lots of Yakuza involvement here. We get the International Shopping Arcade as another location. There's Tsukiji along the Sumida River. This was the former home to the foreigners after the opening of Tokyo, and so it's a central point for the Western Wraiths. And when we get to the Wraith section, I'm going to have questions about the whole, like, where you die versus the culture you're in and how that influences wraithness, because that's a thing. Then we have Kanda. There's an electronics market here called Akihabara and a book market called Jimbocho. Then probably the biggest section is Ueno Hill. This is where the final shogun-loyal samurai called the Shogitai resisted the emperor when he kind of tried to take back power from the shogunate in the Meiji Restoration of the 19th century. Some of the notable places include Ueno Park, lots of museums, temples, and shrines, as well as a zoo, but then also maddened wraiths, corrupted hien, who have likewise corrupted the dreamers. This is where the Tomorrow Garden's remnants reside as well. The Toshiku Shrine, which is the largest in the nation, Shinobazu Pond, full of birds, and the Shitamachi Museum, which is like a living history village, but also a center of the homeless population, which will be relevant later. Then some souvenir shops, some foodstuffs, and Sensoji Temple, the oldest in Japan. There is a really cool sidebar on page 35 about the spiritual consequences of like post-disaster rebuilding. The Wicked City thing that they call it, about like corrupting dragon lines. I don't know. It's very complicated, and I don't know that I fully grokked all of it, but I quite liked it as, again, pointing to that architectural history as being significant. We have Ikebukuro, which is ruled by the mannequins. These are inanime from Changeling who occupy like department store figurines and statues and whatnot. And then Shinjuku, which, quote, manifests the collision of ancient and hypermodern, high-tech and lowbrow. Probably one of the most well-known areas of Tokyo outside of Japan. It's kind of like a microcosm of the whole city. Some of the notable places include Shinjuku Station, which is the busiest rail station in the world. There's Kabukicho and the Golden Gai, which are a red light district and famous for bar hopping, bohemian culture. Note also that this is the section where we get interrupted by 3 whole-ass pages on the Shadowlands and Subway.
Woo!
So, an odd placement, but the basic details are that with the rapid development of Tokyo, there are more relics than can be preserved, and the lack of cemeteries means that cremation was kind of a standard practice, but that also creates bottlenecked access to pathos for wraiths. The society of the Shadowlands here is traditional and patriarchal, ruled by force-based authority against neighborhood councils of ghosts, I suppose. Control of the pathos defines classes of those who have it and those who don't, and that drives conflict along with the occupation versus resistance dichotomy that we'll get to later in the book. I wish I spoke more Wraith so that I could have gotten this more, but I like that they've thought through the consequences of these cultural practices. And then there's thousands of people living in the subways with a higher than usual concentration of the Shen, mainly Nezumi, the were-rats, but they try not to attract attention. The wall is weaker here, naturally. After all of that on Shinjuku, there's also a sidebar on the Yakuza, their history as volunteer militias, their semi-public legitimacy, the honorable Robin Hood image mixed in with often extreme and or right-wing violence. This is all the stuff that I was kind of longing for in the previous chapter. So I guess it's good it found its way in. Last couple districts, there's Shibuya, which has the other busiest railway station in the world, Roppongi, which is the playground of Tokyo with the main club scene. They go into details about these metaphysical clubs that provide specific experiences, like the club Swirl hosts Genji Kueijin, who create chi imbalance in the customers to let them experience how that feels. Animation Club brings furniture to life using blood shintai, etc. And then finally, the landmarks section, we get Narita Airport and Friendly Fish Land, which seems like a satire of Disney, I guess because of copyright issues. And yeah, that's pretty much Tokyo. Thoughts?
Well, I figure this would be an appropriate time to include one of 2 asides. I'm going to do one now, which is Terry's Rapid Guide to Wraith, and later we're going to do Flood-Prone Josh's Rapid Guide to the Kuijin. So the Shadowlands is also the term for the low penumbra, the top layer of the low umbra. We are used to dealing with Western wraiths who are ruled over notionally by the Dark Kingdom of Iron and its seat of power in Stygia or Stygia. In the East, for much of it, it is ruled by the Yellow Emperor Qingxi Huangdi, and there is much discussion on what that entity is. In the same way that we have Charon in the West, who at times is insane and other times is able to wipe out a firstborn with his bare hands. The Yellow Emperor is a figure that has much mystery surrounding him. The Shadowlands in China and Japan are tyrannically ruled, even more so than they are in the West. And anyone who is not Chinese in the setting is very much considered to be a second, third class, fourth class slave material just to be soul forged in that setting. It is referred to as the occupied territories. Wraiths, to power both their ability to heal and their ability to use powers, need access to something called pathos. It is considered roughly analogous to quintessence, and one of the things that annoys me is when Revised was like, yep, they're all the same. And we started getting these weird questions where it's like, if I have a Wraith sleep inside of my soul gem, can I use that to recover blood? And I'm like, none of those words mean the same thing. Please stop. You're hurting everyone. So because the area is so densely populated and because the area is notionally controlled by the Dark Kingdom of Jade under Qingxi Huangdi, there is very much a fight to gain access to that pathos. In the occupied territories, there is a tension between the Wraiths there, again, being occupied, and the Dark Kingdom of Jade requiring a steady flow of pathos and jade, which is kind of their building material, to go back to the administrative center, while not extracting so much that the local wraiths rebel against the power of the empire. So we have this tension in the book between what it talks about the neighborhood councils that control access to pathos in the form of strong emotions. In this case, most often viewed in terms of prayer to one's ancestors, ancestor veneration, or at least respect towards them. The other easiest source of pathos in a lot of cases would be a place like an amusement park or a movie theater or something like that. But those kind of places of life and vitality also tend to have a higher wall/shroud/gauntlet rating, making it much harder for the wraiths to harvest that vital feeling there. Pathos is an embodied thing that can be transferred between wraiths. There's also a number of arts and arcanoi that center around this. And as was previously said, the book does kind of assume that you are already familiar with all those wraithly powers. Like at parts it says, oh, by the way, you need to be familiar with the way of the farmer. And it will just make throwaway references to those kind of powers. You don't have to have an intimate familiarity to make it through. I was able to make it through. I mean, I read Dark Kingdom of Jade and Dark Kingdom of Jade Adventures years ago when I thought we were going to do more Wraith stuff on Mage the Podcast. But you can get by having the wiki open. I would say that is the level of additional help that would be kind of required to do. But Way of the Artisan and I think Way of the Farmer probably are the most recognized things to be done there. But the key takeaway there for the underworld, and this will come up later, is Japan is considered occupied by the Chinese race under the tyrannical control of Qingxi Huangdi, who may or may not be a demon or have been replaced by one. This is contested territory. Wraiths are in a regular fight to gain access to the material they need to survive. This would be somewhat analogous to Vampire if it were an area that had far too many vampires and most of the mortal kind were controlled by a very small handful of them that were very defensive of the mortals that could be fed from.
Just as a quick note also, I mean, obviously, I wish I had read Dark Kingdom of Jade before this, but when I got to chapter 4, that did actually help fill in a lot of the holes here as well. So yes. That was good.
Oddly ordered is the feeling I got.
Yeah.
In the same way that it talked about the effigies, and I'm like, what the dink? And then I just found out it's like, oh, these are mannequins.
Yeah.
I thought it was something way more exciting than that. Puka, it's your chapter. Do you want to control who, like, popcorn, who talks next?
One or both Joshes. Eat some popcorn.
I have a question more than a comment, really, because it's like like any of these setting books talking about a specific area and stuff about in the real world. Does it need updating how much of updating does it need in the last 26 years?
Yes.
Like as opposed to just inaccuracies. Like I don't know enough about Japan to really know how much. I know more about Japan than Tokyo, if that makes any sense. But yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one thing is that they keep on and on about Akihito, and like he abdicated, so he's done.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing.
Yeah, a lot of this concerns about what to do with the emperor. And it's like, well, that question has slightly been resolved in the intervening time.
There's also a sidebar at the end about Tokyo, but then Japan as a whole. It's like, oh, they're overdue for a disaster, and we did get a disaster in 2011. So
actually, the one thing in that too, like it feels kind of like when you hear this is if anything, I'd say American bent. It seems like it's emphasizing the emperor a bit too much in terms of maybe not the cultural, but the like political relevance of the emperor, in the same way that like when you hear Americans talking about UK monarchs, they're there, but they're not like as relevant to the day-to-day politics as you think.
So I think that's true, and it's also not true, right? Because Japan and Japanese people are, like anywhere, a mix of people who care and do not care about things like that, right?
Yeah.
And the impact of ancestor worship and hierarchical relationships in Japan is still a prevalent and impactful like thing. So it makes some sort of sense, but more particularly if you view this book as a step away from anime and into the World of Darkness, that all tracks even more, right? Like it is definitely Japan through that lens.
Yeah. I'm not saying the cultural relevance, but it made it sound like I think the emperor had more political import as opposed to ceremonial, cultural, whatever import. But
the feeling I got from it is in the same way that vampires tend to be mired in the past. The feeling I got is it was trying to set up this belief among wraiths that the wraiths were under that impression too, because it had been, because this may be me putting on my apologetics hat, because I think among the four of us, I am the most aggressive to say this book is fine. Where you had wraiths who've been around for centuries and they remember when the emperor was strong. They see modernity where the emperor can't do anything and says, well, surely this is the problem, not the fact that we invented democracy in the meantime.
Yeah. And I do think there's like in many constitutional monarchies, however you want to call it, there's the what can the emperor do versus what the emperor will do. And it's almost an irrelevant distinction, but it's also important.
The role of the emperor is a historically complicated thing in Japan, right?
Yeah,
Josh, you were mentioning this before, right? Like the emperor in Japan has very rarely had ultimate authority in Japan. When you mentioned in the history, it's unclear. I mean, in real history, it was unclear. Is the emperor?
The problem is they didn't mention what an emperor was before they talked about something relevant. But yes, I get it.
Right.
Yeah, there's not enough specifics in the chapter overall about what makes Japan and Tokyo unique as a place and culturally, and that was, whether that's a flaw in research or just an approach to writing it.
Yeah, and even within Japan, what makes it unique, I thought was
There's one thing I want to jump in and pull out that Puka mentioned is the Wicked City. And I will just do a very quick reference to the Yama Kings are a thing from Kindred of the East, as well as actual Asian history. But the Yama Kings are demons with extreme power or lesser or more power. And the Wicked City is one of the more impressive domains of Yomi, the area where the demon kings live. And Wicked City is an anime reference to a wonderful anime. Depends. A wonderful anime that is very specifically about a corruptive, supernatural, demonic city that is taking over Tokyo. And so its presence here is, I think, actually a little understated because it is this demonic reflection separate from both the Umbra and the underworld that also exists, that is also beginning an incursion onto Tokyo. So those references here in the book, they tie deeper into that Kindred of the East lore, but it is not, again, like most of the stuff here, it is referenced, but you have to know that for it to make a whole lot of sense.
And kind of the Yama Kings are an interesting figure within the World of Darkness, because in the same way that you could view the Outer Lords and the Fondi as being entities that are attempting to subvert mages to their service that other mages fight against, the Yama Kings serve the same in context to the Kuei-jin. They're these vast spiritual entities of great power that have difficulty entering our reality, but generally work through agents to subvert people and are kind of viewed as enemies. Kuei-jin that have fallen to them or made pacts with them are referred to as Akuma. And the thing about them is the Yama Kings are very personable in a weird way. Like they're given regular motives. Like with a lot of astral entities or high umbral entities, they're kind of inscrutable. So the ratio of how easy they are to understand to how powerful they are is kind of different than a lot of other spiritual entities. And there are a few that we get over the course of it. Most of these are outlined in the book, I think, Thousand Hells.
Yep.
And then there's the problem of, so where are the Thousand Hells? And
I was going to ask you that. That was that's the thing I've never understood.
Yeah, to which I would say, Josh, good question. Moving on. So the reason I say that is they could be in the Dark Umbra. They could be in the Deep Umbra. They could be in the Far Dreaming. Like we're given very mixed references as to where they are. And I don't know about anyone else. I don't feel we need another place out in the other worlds, but that's just kind of me. The ones that get the most play are probably Ravana in Lanka, the demon city of the Rakshas, who presides over the souls of the violent. This is interesting just because the term Ravana is used by a couple of different things. We have Emma O of the Night Realm. We have Tomu, who gets even more coverage in World of Darkness Hong Kong from the Hell of Being Skinned Alive and is one of the more active agents. And then we have Mikaboshi of the Wicked City, who notionally each of these has a dominion over a type of soul. But we also get the idea that you can kind of wind up anywhere. Like that there are bureaucratic oopsies that may have you suddenly be in a particular hell. The Yama Kings are kind of fighting amongst each other because they believe that when the Sixth Age come, when the Wheel of Ages turns, that when Chronicles of Darkness is printed, that one of them will become the ruler of the Sixth Age. And the assumption is one of the Yama Kings will become the Demon Emperor. So one of the common driving forces that you can have in a World of Darkness game in this setting is the Yama Kings are fighting. They're assuming that the most powerful from among them will be able to become the Demon Emperor, but there's no requirement to do it. I mean, you could argue that Qingxi Huangdi is trying to position themselves into that. You could argue that Vormos, Grand Harvester of Souls, is trying to do that. You could argue, it would be a terrible argument, but you could argue that High King David is attempting to become the Demon Emperor. Why not? So just a little bit of background on that. So it's one of those giant setting conceits that is vital and important. And if you don't know what it is, a lot of this will be like, well, this is weird.
Yeah. The one thing I want to add here is that several of these Yama Kings have names from Japanese or other Asian mythological sources. For example, Mikaboshi is a figure, sort of, in Japanese Shinto. Insofar as, at least in English, there is very little information about who or what Mikaboshi is. So someone in the World of Darkness totally ran in a direction, and that direction may or may not have anything to do with real Japanese cultural traditions.
Also an important character in Marvel continuity, yes. I will point out. So most of the things that have been written about Mikaboshi have been Westerners talking about an Asian entity, which I love because frequently I see depictions of seemingly in anime where Jesus is leading an army of people in mecha suits or something, and it'd be like, okay, if that's the direction we want to go for our Lord and Savior, you know what? I'm here for it. If Moses had a space laser and that's how he stopped the Pharaoh and that's how the Sea of Reeds was parted, I'm okay with this.
The Gospel of Kaiju, according to Terry.
Exactly. I'm in this strange way. I am cosmopolitan.
And just to throw my 2 cents in on that, Odin is a centaur-like creature thing in Final Fantasy, right, with a weird spear. I'm here for that.
Everyone gets one. So I had my commentary. Did I have anything else? The thing I liked about this section, back to the places, the bars at first I thought were stupid, but I think a lot of these are actually pretty compelling locations to have a very flavorful place of setting things. The idea that different clubs have different focuses. Careless Western Supernaturals was one of my favorite phrases because it sounded like a Neutral Milk Hotel cover band. And as I can't remember who said it originally, but the weird World of Darknessification of it, where it was like, yeah, it may be fun by day, but every night 10,000 prostitutes mysteriously disappear. And you run the numbers on that and you're like, how is there anyone left? The other thing that I thought was interesting is it seems to be trying to set up not quite plot hooks, but what I refer to as plot studs, the things that you mount a plot hook on, in terms of it being like, oh, a large enough earthquake could usher in the Sixth Age. And this is how Tokyo is poised on the level of disaster. Only after realizing this book was so thoroughly a Wraith book did that make sense to me, where it was like, what is the thing that upsets the balance of power? A whole bunch of Tokyoites dying, going into the underworld, and suddenly the occupying powers do not have the ability to control the populace anymore. And that is the rebellion that potentially frees Japan. Whereas everyone else would be like, oh, this is terrible. Like, there is no generally player-facing faction in the World of Darkness except for Wraiths, who would view a massive earthquake as a boon. Like, no one wants to see 2 million people die and a city burst aflame. Like, no one wants to rule over the ashes of Tokyo, except for maybe in the underworld.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
So before we make sense of Chapter 3, The Secret Players, we probably need some background on how the vampires of Asia, as it were, synecdoche with Werewolves of London, work. Lolan, Josh, can you give us a walkthrough of that?
Sure. So the Kindred of the East, or the Wankwe, or the Kuei-jin, which, trust me, those are all mostly made-up words.
Or the Fallen Wanjian, my favorite.
Yes. They are very different from Cainites or your Western vampires, right? They are actually more closer to Wraiths and Risen in that they are people that die, go to the underworld, specifically to one of the 1,000 hells of the Yama Kings, and then they crawl out of that hell into their body again. They start devouring bodies like a monster on the street, and then they are eventually led out of that monstrous nature and are set on a path or a dharma that they are given to use as a way of controlling their pun and ho natures. I am totally mispronouncing those, but your yin or yang energies, effectively, right? That's really important to know, is that Kindred of the East, these vampires are actually, they are very similar to Wraiths in that they share a lot of similar concepts, these connections to various types of energy or chi. At the same time, the Hengeyokai, or the Shifters of the East, are very similar in that they are attuned to the dragon lines, these energies of chi that the vampires are also interested in. And instead of hating each other or wanting to kill each other, they actually often work with each other as long as they're not directly fighting over a dragon's nest or a cairn or a node or whatever term you would like to use in the World of Darkness for that center of energy, right? That context is really important in that, like, you often have multi-shen or multi-groups of various World of Darkness entities working with one another, right? Instead of existing as separate antagonistic groups. They are certainly, there is antagonism within them, but that ability to interact and work with and work for each other is really essential in recognizing that if you want to have a weretiger appear in your vampire game, that is totally appropriate. If you want vampires to walk into the underworld, vampires in Asia, for whatever reason, for the reasons I mentioned before, can walk easily into the underworld as they can into the Umbra. In the Western World of Darkness, you're not going to see most Kindred in the Umbra ever. That's not true with these Kindred of the East, right? So there's more. There's 1,000 things more that I could probably provide here, but I think that's the essential background that's helpful for framing some of this character elements here.
The feeling I always got was that in East Asia, it wasn't that everyone got along better. It's just that you were constantly communicating with your enemies. Like, I feel like people underestimate the degree to which the US and the Soviet Union talked throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Like, there was constant communication back and forth. That doesn't mean they got along well. It was just kind of this diplomatic necessity. So there is less ignorance, but there is not more cooperation. It's just one of those things where everyone's dancing kind of closer together. So when you get stabbed, it tends to be a little bit more intimate. And I also got the vague impression that they were more non-werewolf shifters in East Asia. Is that just my impression, or is that actually the case? Okay.
No, that's actually the case because, one, there are less wolves in most of the parts of Asia that they're talking about, right? And the War of Rage didn't occur here. The War of Rage being werewolves killing all the other shifters. It didn't occur in most of Asia, right? So the Beast Courts are this group of Hengai that interact with each other and work with each other. So you're going to see in New York City, you would never see Gero working with a Ratkin, right? They would kill each other before that's going to happen. Here in Asia, they're part of the same court. They're part of the same pack. That is very normal, is what we are told, at least in these areas.
Upland, Josh, or Pook, do we have any commentary on changelings in East Asia that we want to add at this point? Like a little encapsulation?
Yeah.
Luckily, mages are just humans, and humans are everywhere. So there's no weird difference in being like, oh, you have an East Asian soul. Your avatar, like shadow puppetry or something like that.
I think the key thing is that the Xian, which are the Fae of East Asia, the way that they're presented in Land of 8 Million Dreams, which came out the same month as this book, is that they fundamentally have very little to do with the dreaming, very little to do with glamour or banality, all of which are like key things for the non-Eastern Asian Fae. I mean, they're much more closely tied to all of the things that Lowland just mentioned, the Hangyoke and all of that, because they do have yin qi and yang qi, and they're very committed to answering prayers, maintaining traditions, engaging with mortal communities, and also can function kind of like Risen because sometimes they occupy dead bodies. So they operate on very different principles. That being said, in this book, we do have examples of both Western and Eastern Fae. This is actually the only time in all of the World of Darkness we get actual stat blocks for Xian as they are written up in their final form. Hong Kong has something else going on.
Mm-hmm.
Upland, Josh, anything to add?
Yeah, you can think of them as two different games entirely.
Yeah.
Except for Light of Email Dreams references a few rules that are in Changing the Dreaming. But other than that...
They don't have Seelie, Unseelie. They don't have Chimera, they have spirits.
Yeah, it's even more disconnected from Changeling than the Qui-Gen are from Vampire.
Yeah. Well, and really, it's a spin-off of Kindred of the East more than a spin-off of Changeling. So.
Yep.
Is this the part where we just tell everyone to get in the realm of gods and dreams and use that instead? Or
yes, and also listen to our episode on Land of 8 Million Dreams. Listen to our episode on both books, because we go through this in much more detail.
Land of Gods and Dreams and the Storyteller Vault. Excellent.
So who would like to talk about their night folk first?
Well, should we start with the Wraiths first?
Okay. The first one we get is Yanqi, the 47th Ronin that didn't kill themselves. They battled the Imperial Reapers and Yu Huang. Reapers are people that go into the underworld who find newly arrived Wraiths, and if they like them, help them join whatever power structure they are part of. If they don't like them, they may just kill them or turn them into a footstool, as happens in the opening of World of Darkness Hong Kong. Larger than life with centuries of knowledge. I feel like this was like the Han Solo arriving in your Star Wars game. Like where it's like, whoa, cool, notable historical figure. And Wraith is all over the map for those. Where they're like, Andrew Carnegie is constantly being tortured in the underworld, where other people are like, Hypatia, we've been making room for you. So it's kind of an interesting place for the political commentary or historical fan fiction creation of the authors to pop up. Pookie, you had a comment about the 47th Ronin?
Yeah, just the way he's presented here, there's a lot of stock set in like, oh, nobody knows what happened to him, and he was punished for his cowardice for not committing seppuku with the others. And while there is a tradition around that in Japanese lore, because the story of the 47 Ronin is a very well-known trope in Japanese legend, there's lots of films and everything. In most of the traditions, at least the one that I learned when I studied Japanese culture, is that they just sent him away to report on what had happened, and he was pardoned and lived to a ripe old age, which is, I guess, much less interesting from a Wraith perspective. But,
became an accountant. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Do you want to give a quick overview of the Tale of the 47 Ronin too?
So basically there were 47 samurai that served their master who was like murdered by a rival. Ronin in Japanese is like the samurai who are, they don't have a lord that they serve. So they kind of swore revenge on the one who murdered their liege and executed him a year later. But then because it was like dishonorable to do so, they then all immediately committed ritual suicide, except for the one guy who had to go tell the story.
Thank you. The next one we get is Lieutenant Colonel Danforth Devereaux, who worked in the Pacific Theater and was relocated to Tokyo, fanatically pursued his men's killers to the point of killing a prostitute and then having his own throat slit. Continued to help rule Tokyo under the Yellow Emperor, but now is much more callous in pursuing the murderers of his men. The problem I had with this is it was a war. It's not murder then. You had combatants and they shot at each other and possibly stabbed each other. It's like, who killed my men? Maybe this large organized force that you were opposing. So that kind of was confusing to me, unless there was a bit that I didn't understand. Then we get William Yankee Bill Prine, who, along with his spouse, are kind of an interesting duo. He was a business guy who did great in business. He went to Tokyo. He learned the language and culture, retired at 40, unretired after joining the 48th Club, refused to sell to the Yakuza, and then his wife fell out of window onto some bullets, and has intelligence 6, is the first mortal I remember that has like a stat above 5, has true faith in himself. I didn't even know that was an option.
Well done.
The fact that he's like, I am such a prick, I can cause vampires to run away from me. I don't want anything else in my games. Also has 6 dots in finance, because why not? So to me, this is just an absolute pimp juice character where you have to like physically shade your eyes from his arrogance. But I mean, he's got the goods to back it up. So I guess it's maybe not arrogance at that point. His wife was Noriosemi Mama Prine, was the spouse of William, died at 33 in a random mugging. Or was it notable for having hair that is approximately 75 feet long, which is one of the recurring art motifs. An interesting pair. This is, again, something that's really easy to, in my opinion, drop into a game. All of these wraiths, to me, so far at least, are pretty compelling. Then we get, last but not least, Amiko Kodano, whose family was part of a cult called the Wandering Star, led by someone called the Wandering Star, who had their people wander. Moved to a Shinto shrine, and no one was allowed to leave. The father left the cult. His body was never found. Amiko got inducted into the inner circle, stabs the cult leader in the throat. Leaves, wanders away, is found by the hotel staff of the 48th. That is the entity that Yankee Bill Prine is over, and has 3 dots in psychic abilities, hand wavy motion. So we kind of get the idea that Amiko may have gotten some premonition of where this was going to go. And I just think makes as an interesting stereotypical ingenue character that also has psychic powers and stabs someone in the throat. Reading both of these supplements reminded me of how bloody the rest of the World of Darkness is compared to Mage, where you're like, I'm going to teach this enchanted fire hydrant how to read. And that was kind of my feeling there. The next section is the Koijin and the Kindred. Pook, walk us through the undead.
Yes. So briefly, I think this is spelled out in the Kindred of the East core book, but the sort of core political division among the Japanese Koijin is House Bishamon and House Genji, who are respectively kind of traditionalist and kind of progressive. Feel free to correct me if I've got that wrong, but I think that's basically what it is. And the eldest and most powerful of the Koijin among those in Japan is Hakari. He is of House Bishamon. He is a 1,000 Whispers samurai. 1,000 Whispers are... It's too complicated to get into, but they're the cool ones. They're the ones He was an advisor to Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the most famous of the shoguns of Japan. And after he died, he returned to keep on serving the shogunate, because he's like that. So he's a very secluded traditionalist who kind of stepped back into power after World War II and has been managing things in Tokyo among the Koijin ever since. His right hand is Yoshida Ozaki, who is a devil tiger. They're the sort of nasty ones that lean into their beastly nature, to put it in vampire terms. He is the, quote, epitome of the successful Yakuza chief. He is the voice of Hakari outside of the palace. He is ruthlessly efficient, and he hangs out at the 48th Club along with, apparently, half of the Shen of Tokyo. And then the third one we get is Hirotagana. He used drugs and cheating to fuel his goal of becoming a film star before falling in with the wrong motorcycle gang. He's kind of like a synthesis of all Japanese crime film in one character. And he's a resplendent crane, who are, I thought, the sort of most human-leaning ones, but he doesn't seem very nice. So those are the 3 Koijin. Compared with the Hong Kong book, there's a lot less attention to kind of like their time in hell and how they see their return as an atonement, which was something I really liked in that book. So here we get just much more about their mortal lives, and then like, by the way, they're back now. So that's how they're presented here. And then we get one Western kindred, which is Preston Varick. He is a Tremere protege of Oliver Thrace, who we'll see in the Hong Kong book. He's trying and mostly failing to extend the clan's power into Japan, but then on the side has a smuggling company that's doing quite well. None of these characters have 75-foot hair. Missed opportunity.
Cool. Next up are the mages. We get a fair number of these because people are like, well, we have a bunch of vampires. I guess we need to have a bunch of mages. Even though in like a Mage City book, we were like, we will tell you about both mages here. Tokyo is listed as a place that is loved by the virtual adepts, what for all of its gadgets. Shiro Koike awoke when he wasn't sure if his work was useful, which, seen. Worked in communication technology, especially TV, makes unremarkable changes to his appearance, except for his glasses always keep up with current material science. So I like the idea of him having like grapheme glasses with pentaquark lenses or something. Arete 5. Flashback to every crossover book where they're like, I don't know how powerful mages are. Let's give them an Arete of 17. I'm like, sure, why not? Each of these characters is given a secret. And his secret is he doesn't know what's going on, which I think is the secret of every mage character, at least, even if not NPCs. The Void Engineers are interested in the simulated environments of Tokyo, and Hayashi is part of the Observer Corps. Not a thing in the Void Engineers. Defected from the traditions, slowly going insane. Nice. Again, roughly 7-foot long hair. Mixed ancestry, is partially Irish, which makes her a target of businessmen. Sure. McHale served for the Syndicate for more than 40 years, worked with the Reds, trying to help the Syndicate gain power over government through profitable international deals.
And a communist syndicate.
Yeah, yes. I was fascinated by that too, because
how does that work?
Exactly. The role of the technocracy under the Iron Curtain is talked about in precisely one book that isn't for Mage, The Red Sign, which goes into great detail about the 5 technocracy waves to influence the Supreme Soviet. He's learned about Strike Force Zero, has lost 2 colleagues. Odd because the technocracy has ties in Demon Hunter X to Strike Force Zero. Arete 7. Sure. We get Jukichiro Watanabe, who controls the Zaibatsu's Tokyo operations. In Mage, what we call the technocracy from country to country has changed over time. See the Mage the Podcast episode on Dragons of the East, which goes into detail on it. There's a couple different ways to interpret the technocracy in East Asia. My favorite is kind of that they are corresponding organizations, in that there, for instance, is the Catholic Church, and then there are churches that the Catholic Church has said, yeah, they're basically Catholic, close enough, they don't have a pope, but like their sacraments are interchangeable with ours at a 1-to-1 rate with a 5% transfer fee or something like that. Then we get the interpretation in M20 that was actually a Nephandic propaganda. And I'm like, well, that's a direction to take things. More information on that on Technocracy Reloaded. Watanabe wants to see one world, but on Japanese terms. So I kind of like that. We get the idea that the technocracy of East Asia is more interested in order and balance than in the Western technocracy's notion of progress and control. All of those are arguable, but that is just one high-level way of interpreting it. We get information on the Wukang. Tokyo has the second largest population of Wukang outside of Hong Kong. And we get the idea that all of the groups in China have kind of been banished due to the ascension of the Communist Party. So you have the Wukang, who are the cross-dressing demon worshippers, the Wulong, the highly ordered Confucian dragon wizards, the Akashiyana, every other group, all kind of jammed into Hong Kong, which we'll talk about later, thinking that everyone else controls the rest of China. And this is one of my favorite weird little conceits in the World of Darkness, where it's actually 3 people inside of a coat closet fighting each other, thinking that the rest of the house is controlled by everyone else. and that's the World of Darkness I'm here for. We have Peapizasa Deira, who is part of a family that has serviced the Wukang for over 1,600 years and is in control of the cleaning crews of Tokyo Airport and has contacts throughout the kind of cleaning societies of the rest of Tokyo. is poised because within canon in the year 2000, that will be the last year of service the Wu Kang have to the demons that they promised their souls to for 3,000 years. And what happens when that occurs? We don't know. We get a little bit of information in Dragons of the East that this has just happened, and now we have 2 weird factions, and we never get an M20 update for that. Apparently there was an attempt to, but they weren't able to find anyone who was interested in writing it. Okay, that's fine. Do whatever you want at your table. We get a little information on the Wulong. This is, again, their second biggest place. They absolutely hate communist China. We get Wei Xin, who is part of the traditionalists, and only wants industrialization that is in line with Confucianism. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like a fun sentence. Wants to rule all of China, and the Wulong have sweared to exterminate the Kuei-jin, but they never said when. So in the meantime, Hua is kind of on good terms, is very somber, not obsessed in comparison to most Wulong, just strongly motivated. And no one listed here has more than 3 spheres, appears regularly on television as kind of an influencer, trying to promote traditional Japanese value. We get a few other notable characters as well that you can play with and drop into your chronicles. I like that all of these have either an interesting background or an interesting opinion. As Josh of the North pointed out, the idea of a communist syndicate member, I am fascinated by, and I just shut up and take my money. But that kind of covers the mages.
Which brings us into the shapeshifters or the Hengei Yokai. And I will preface all of this information with my general takeaway from this is I had to remind myself that this was a Wraith book because I read each one of these characters and was like, individually by themselves interesting, but I have no idea really how they connect to anything else presented in this book. They just seem to be one-off characters with little to no interesting engagement in everything else that we've been presented with. So you get Ozatu Junichiro. He's a Haken who works for the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishing, which must be very hard as a werewolf to work in that type of bureaucracy. Exactly. And he has 4 rage too, so it's not like it's super easy for him to just be like, I'm not, gonna kill everyone that I deal with.
You said this meeting would be catered.
Yeah. Individually as a character, interesting, but the only Haken we get in a book where the Haken are supposed to be fairly common in Japan, particularly in Tokyo. And that was a little disappointing to me, where it was like, you should give me more of these people, right? If this is a World of Darkness Tokyo book, and it's not. It is a Wraith book that happens to include some characters from outside of it. You've got Hashimoto Takai, who is a Rodin's a Nezumi, so a rat-born rat shifter, who, what I love about him is several of these characters have a connection to Strike Force Zero, and Strike Force Zero is this anime group of hunters that go around and do anime hunting things. Again, if this was in Demon Hunter X or one of those other books, I'd been like, cool, that all makes sense. It just feels like someone wrote these characters for other books and was like, we're going to put them in the Tokyo book.
We need more tie-ins.
Exactly. You've got Densosu Ito, who is a Khan or a Tiger Shifter. Again, not really connected to anything in the book, but otherwise an interesting character if you're looking for a Khan to use somewhere in Japan. 2 different Western changers. Apep Looks Down. What I find interesting about Apep is he's a silent strider who's been in Japan since at least 1951. Maybe this might be a typo because they say he spent all of the last decade in Japan. But it's unclear as if that means the last actual decade or spent a decade since 1951. It's very unclear the way this sentence is written. But interesting character, very long-lived, and it adds some spice, some connections that may or may not be there for you. Then there's Nikolai Zadarevsky, who is a Western Shadow Lord, as opposed to a Haken Shadow Lord, who has taken on this mantle of being a noble Russian hero, but isn't. And that's just a guise that he has put on over everything. So, interesting characters if you have a specific reason to engage werewolves in this area. I originally bought this book because I was going to send my werewolf characters to Tokyo and decided after reading all of these to send them to a different city instead.
Kyoto. Just rearrange the letters.
Yeah, So that brings us to the Fae.
Okay, so we have the Fae, much like the vampires, broken up, much like a lot of these, broken up into the two groups, the Xian and the Changelings. I would say Kithane, if you're to do that. That's because they're both Changelings in a sense. But anyway, the first for the Xian, there's Mako Sahura. He's a Land of 8 Million Dreams pronunciation, Chu Yu, which is one of the nobles who are metal/death aligned. His backstory was where he was stop a cool girl being assaulted, and then the gang people doing it threw him into a harbor, and then he popped out and took revenge on them. He's now a very powerful businessman. Yeah, and he's like short normally, but over 7 feet tall in his sort of Fey form thing, and he's really doesn't like mortals very much. Really focused, like super focused on the whole like avenging things and stuff like that. And the other's Emiko Tsuwata. She's also one of the noble kiths, which is kind of interesting that they only do the noble ones. Suijin. It's water aspected. So she was actually a what's the word for it? Anyway, died in the womb, it says. So she's been a Xian her entire life, which is a bit unusual. She like sinking ships and is anti-modernity and stuff. These are interesting takes on Xian. If you've read Land of Mutual Dreams, there's no commoners, and there's 3 Kithane to 2 Xian, which is a bit odd. But I don't think they're the best examples of Xian NPCs to use.
But they're the only ones.
I was about to say, do we get any actual ones?
Yeah, and they both like of the nobles only. It was just weird. And then we have of the Changeling / Kithane, we have a Japanese American whose parents work in the U.S. Embassy, and she's a troll of House Liam for some reason. She gets along well with the Chi-EU. Okay. So she has contacts with Xian and stuff like that. She does like antiquarian things. She works in a museum. And then there's Anna Eastern, Slua, who she just liked Japan, so she moved there from the US. And she's got this whole like sort of old high derelict, no effort into grooming her wardrobe, so she's melbang, hair hangs at tatters. This almost feels like someone took a Nosferatu and rewrote it as a Slua, which does actually work. And then there's Latia Jackson, who's a knocker military brat. Apparently when she went through her chrysalis, it caused a sabotage through the whole home city. So she's like deciding she wants to stay in Tokyo. She's like visiting Tokyo, like works with her father, like she still lives at home. So she's in Tokyo because of her dad's job. And she's thinking of running away from home and staying in Tokyo because she likes it so much.
So for the mages, they tend to be high arete but low sphere spread. For the other lines, is there anything notable that jumps out at you being like, oh, this is different than how these NPCs are normally presented?
I mean, the Xian are swole.
Okay.
I think. They've got Yugen 8, which is pretty high because that's like the glamour equivalent.
Okay. But that's their gas tank, right? That is their quintessence.
Well, they have Chi as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean...
all 3 Kithane have Glamour 5, which is a little bit higher in starting creation, but I think they just didn't know what to write, so they wrote 5 because it's 1 to 10.
in that regard, not unreasonable. How about the shifters, Josh? Is there anything, as someone who speaks fluent werewolf, do these all seem reasonable?
Yeah. I was doing a real quick look through just to make sure, and they are pretty reasonable. The only weird one to me is Apep, who is still only rank 2, and yet somehow, even when this was printed, 50, 60 years old, that seemed a little unusual. Actually, longer than that. I have no idea how old this character is, but it's the only weird thing.
Decades. At least 1 decade.
The one that threw me off about the Wraiths is it seems as if very few of them had resolved any of their fetters. Like all of them had pretty high ratings, but I mean, there's a couple different race directions you can take that. Just as a note, I am in the preparation phase for a Wraith Chronicle, so I'm at the familiar with the text, but not familiar with how it plays at the table level of things. I do find it interesting when they give them Western versus Eastern Arcanoi. Like, it seems a little bit odd to me that Yanqi has Western Arcanoi, but I don't know if that's just the easiest way to kind of list things. I find it interesting that Devereaux has very high Mnemonacy.
Minimus.
MEMOSYNIS.
The memory one?
Yeah, the memory manipulation one.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we move into the last chapter?
Melissa Uran is allowed to do every character art ever from now on.
Forever, yes. I wish any of them had a BMI above 5. But the only exception to that is the Russian character, who I don't think was done by Mel, and it's a notable exception. I just picture the art note being like, we need a Russian that looks like a brick shit house, and Mel just being like, I don't know how. I can't do it, and having to pass it on to another artist.
It looks like she did it. I see her signature, but he's sitting down, so maybe he's obscuring his svelte, trim physique.
Oh, okay.
The waist of every one of these characters is trim, to say the
Yes.
least, right? Like, if it's over 19 inches for even our Russian gentleman, I would be shocked.
Yeah.
The smallest of technicalities, I would say that Makas Shahura does have a higher BMI just because he would be made out of metal in that picture.
Reasonable, yes. Yes. Still probably is sporting a waist of no more than 32, despite being 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
And if you got a little booby, you got a lot. Looking at you, Letitia Jackson.
Yep.
I did like the glyph on page 75. I don't know if that is a thing from another line I'm just not familiar with, but it shows what to me would look like a group symbol or glyph of one of the groups in terms of what appears to be a bent bough of bamboo. But after the fact, I'm going to pull that into a PDF editor and see if I can pull that out and probably get stickers made out of it. But anyway.
Is that not the World of Darkness ribcage heart equivalent for the Year of the Lotus or something? Because I feel like I've seen that pop up elsewhere.
The Year of the Lotus had a lotus.
I just mean in the way that you would see the heart and rib cage glyph in a World of Darkness book.
Yeah,
I thought that was like the equivalent.
It looks like an Age of Sorrows type symbol.
Maybe, yeah.
So, and then there's chapter 4, which is either most of the book or none of the book, depending on how you plan on using this. It just starts with what it refers to as the War of 1,000 Generations, that the Deadlands, as I mentioned before, is being dominated by the dead of China. They want to get rid of the foreigners. This is a unifying idea across the Shen. Most of them want non-native night folk to kind of be gone. But then it mentions that within any group that is being occupied, there will always be collaborators. Some want wealth, some want power. And it mentions that many young creatures just don't care. I like when it refers to werewolves as creatures of yang, because I'm like, that feels like an understatement. Where it's like, they represent the dynamic principle. And then you see one of the Spencer illustrations where someone is just tearing through 213 people contemporaneously. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to say that character has some vitality to them. The occupied government of Japan is ruled from the Imperial Hotel, which is built in 1923 and then leveled in 1967, but is still in the Shadowlands. We don't get any information on how these places are able to persist for so long, because one of the ideas in Wraith is that when you're directly in the Shadowlands, things will stick around for only so long. So I'm assuming that they're putting some sort of Arcanoi into trying to preserve that yet longer, or alternatively, in East Asia, maybe things are slower to depart. The Imperial Hotel was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and was immediately challenged by an earthquake and was able to stand through it. And I thought that was an interesting bit. The ruler is General Shi Leon, who impales his victim on jade poles in the courtyard. Jade is special in East Asian underworld in that is kind of the raw material from which things are shaped when a soul is turned into material. So they control the Yasukun Jinja Shrine, which is very rich in pathos, and where the Kui go, which are kind of these Barghest-like creatures, these people that have been turned into kind of bloodhounds, tend to be made. There are constant efforts to free this location. Dark pathos here isn't controlled, and the shadow is often strong within the occupying bureaucracy. So the question is, what does a bureaucracy look like when 10% of the time the darkest aspects of your employees come to show? This kind of explains why the bureaucracy of the underworld needs to be so rigid, because at all times people have something dark whispering in their ear, pulling them towards oblivion, which Josh, I don't know if actual government is like that, but...
Yes.
I got one yes and one no. It mentions that about 1% of all wraiths work in the territorial government. You have the night workers, who are the lowest tier, that are just kind of paper pushers. We get the twilight, which do bookkeeping, and then the day workers who set policies. They are guided by Confucian belief. And kind of the balancing factor we need to keep in mind at all times is the fact that the occupying force is probably outnumbered, but has the preponderance of organization and power. So just as with any occupying force, they are smaller, but they use force to implement and preserve what they have, as well as a network of informants, so you never know who within your group could be plotting against you. We get some more information on collaborators and who chooses to do this. Some had a good life, and in the afterlife, they wish to maintain it. During setbacks, they may leave collaboration. We have the ambitious, who are seeking power, and collaboration is one of those sources. Yu Huang does not allow non-Chinese to rule Chinese, so that is kind of a restriction on how far you can rise. But in an occupied territory, this means that non-Chinese can rise to somewhat of a position of power. They do need supervision. They often collect relics and other things that the occupying power may not care about as much. The young are simply those who want to hurt the world. These are often people who burnt out on the stresses of Japanese life and just kind of want to hurt other people. They may serve as entertainers or gophers, and they can rise through the ranks, taking advantage of their ample area knowledge. You have the rejected. Those are those who lived long lives, and some felt humiliated by the collapse of Imperial Japan. A lifetime of traditional values got them nothing, and many say that Japan needs reform. And then you have the visionaries, who see the occupation as a platform to change Japan. So these are the people who are like, no, I'm going to establish myself with the greatest power just because that allows me the greatest platform to promulgate my ideas. They see Chinese culture as a potentially useful synthesis from which they can propel Japan forward. It is interesting that all of these organizations are very much focused on kind of the political goings-on of Japan's world of the quick, as opposed to their Shadowlands or Underworld. Then we have the resistance. Chinese opposition comes from the struggle against the Qin and the Society of Thousands Hands and Eyes. The struggle is led by Yintaro Koichi, who hates the occupation, was a 19th century naval captain who killed himself via seppuku when he couldn't meet the rising tide of professionalism. I like the idea that's like, I wasn't good enough to serve, so I killed myself, and now I'm in charge. Tends to be conservative and only switch tactics after heavy losses. The Society of Thousand Hands and Eyes, turn of the century industrialist Yuichi Tenzo coordinated society operations, but the group is very much eaten by darkness and absolutely full of specters. These are the wraiths who have given into their shadow. Then we have the coordinators. Atama Jogoro is a Kuijin from the 17th century who discovered the Jade Empire's oppression, mentions closeness with Keiki, which I could only find as a Kopoloe term meaning magic user, which may or may not be what they're referring to, wants to coordinate concerns among the 5 main types of night folk, which is kind of an interesting take. We have the organized opposition, which includes the Fist of Nippon. Kitagawa Hideo uses more modern methods and Western Arcanoi, mentions that there are 50,000 wraiths that get basic training each year. Working backwards, that kind of implies that 3% of the Japanese that die join this group. And that is just absolutely ridiculous. That would be in Mage the analogous to like, oh yeah, 1% of New York City is a mage and is hermetic. And you're like, oh, that's a lot. Nippon Ascending is another group that has 3 detachments of 5,000. They have 2 to 3 times as many untrained assistants. They started with an Extreme War, but scaled back, realizing that Extreme War merely activated the occupiers to become much more brutal. We have the group of the Million Swords. They tend to be close to the samurai daimyo tradition, and that seems to really limit their membership in that we don't have new samurais that are dying, to the best of my knowledge. So the limited to about 20,000 in total across Japan, 3,000 of which are in Tokyo, and they are divided into the Black Knives, which attack supply lines, and the White Knives that do small group combat, and seems to be much more risky. We have the unorganized opposition, of which we get the Doomed Children. Again, lives ended due to pressures of schoolwork and society, tend not to last long, tend to keep a low profile, use guerrilla tactics to resist. The new Divine Wind is the result of a kind of return of Shintoism into popular Japanese belief, and they want to destroy all tools of the occupiers and all buildings. And then we have the Goblin Spiders, who just kind of want tainted chi. Does anyone want to give a quick explainer as to what the Kumo Goblin Spiders are?
I too could use one.
Yeah, this requires a little bit of background in what are they called? The Spider Shifters of the West.
Oh, the Ananasi.
Ananasi, thank you. My brain just
They're my favorite. They're my favorite of the Western shifters.
Yeah. So
why is that?
They're both creepy evil, but at the same time the least bad. Like they're most productive. It's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, and that's actually useful for the context of the Kumo spiders, right? The Ananasi are the most balanced of the werewolf, non-wolf shifters, right? They have aspects that are both worm, wild, and weaver. The Kumo spiders are Ananasi that has said, "F*** that." We are fully embracing the worm, and not just the worm. Those Yama Kings, yeah, we are 100% for them. Destruction of everything, like corruption of every human being and every other Shen possible. Give it to me right now, because I think they were trying to lean into the creepy spider people in some anime that were a thing in the 70s and 80s. So the Kumo are these Ananase that have completely become aspected to the worm and to the Yama Kings.
Thank you. We then get a section entitled Mutual Enemies. We have the mannequins that reign in stores. They have invaded and are called effigies. They collect tribute from the Chimera and wage war on their neighbors. This is interesting but weird to me in that it implies a incredible density of changelings, which may or may not be the case. I am fine having this as a legend, or I would want to put it in something closer to a department store where there's one or two places. But that's just me. Josh or Pook, do you have any thoughts on the ubiquitous mannequin?
It's a little bit weird because they're talking about mannequins, but they're referencing the automaton realm and not the later inanime book that actually talked about the mannequins. So it's a little... I don't remember the timing of this, but that's a...
This was after both. I mean,
yeah,
this was...
So it's... whoever wrote that hadn't read an anime the secret way, I guess. But it doesn't really make sense for the mannequins as presented there. And if you go it the other way, they'd be a bunch of chimera.
But it does track with the statement that we get in Anime the Secret Way that there are, like, by far more mannequins than any other kind of an anime in the world.
Yeah. So it's not that there's more changelings. It's more, you could almost put it like playable bygones from a Mage perspective.
Yeah, I get the impression that Tokyo may be the capital of the mannequins if we had to pick a location. Is that the impression that you get?
For this it is, but in an anime we're told it's Europe because they have ancient and medieval statues everywhere as well.
Mm.
But even in Changeling, they don't really do the ramification of so many mannequins running around. That should definitely alter the setting than instead of being this sort of rare occasional thing you might encounter as a Changeling.
I mean, I like it as a story hook. Like, that's fine.
If they were all just in this one department store, that would be...
Yeah.
Then we get the Zenrei Bunreiku, which are wraiths that work in teams of 3 to break organizations. And I like any reference to Bunreiku puppetry and that kind of stylized presentation of things. I wish we got more information on what they actually did and to what end, but I do like the idea of your syndicate mage or your hyper-capitalist group trying to figure out what their competition is, and it turns out to be a group of traditional Japanese-style puppeteers that are just slowly breaking organizations that they find unbeautiful within Tokyo or something. We get a section called Other Entanglements, and this section was plagued by the fact that it was not clear what the headings were or what they meant. So we had 3 different header types that were all about the same size to my eyes, and only in reading it a second time did I realize how it was trying to be organized. Other entanglement section, we get the idea that there are a bunch of groups that debate on what the nature of progress should be and what the nature of the emperor should be. Most think Japan needs new leadership. They want Akihito out, at least. Then we have the Phoenix Phalanx, who want to see Japan take it in the face again to realize that they need some other way of doing things. Basically, we need to kick them while they're down, and that'll make them realize that their current way of doing things is bad. The Hanawa want to destroy the imperial palace and return to Kyoto. The new Imperials want to find a new emperor. The Metsuke, the Kuijin secret police, aren't entirely sure what to do, but they kind of try and keep everything under wraps. I do like the idea of there being a group that tries to keep the masquerade, the illusion, the veil, or whatever intact, and tends to kind of smack down the most extreme expressions of Nightfolk activity across the lines. We get an aside on Japan as a lost tribe of Israel. They are looking for a Jewish emperor, and they are called the New Covenant. I don't know if that has any basis in history. It seems like you can step on all toes possibly at once by misapplying it, but it seems neat. So I'm glad they wrote it and I didn't. We have the teachers who believe that progress is good, but it needs to be anchored in tradition. We have the outer Imperials who search for a new emperor out there, and they want there to be a ruthless purge the island of influence. We have the anti-Imperials who are trying to stop the new and old Imperials from doing anything stupid. We also have Jacob Lederer's Revenge, which was Jacob Lederer was a Dutch trader who was put to death for being on the wrong island, became a Mortwright who serves the Yama Queen Tomu. And that is just one of those sentences where you need to know what every word means in it, or it will make no sense. Mortwrights are characters who die extremely violent deaths and then awake immediately as specters, and has promised to a Yama King to force all of Japan to suffer, and tries to drive people to suicide. It is weird to me in that they are the plot hooks that also add to the setting. And I'm never quite sure what to make of those because they have this weird semi-canon status to me. And that's just one of those things that kind of shifts across books. Another one of the story hooks that we get is that China has a collection of touring artifacts and that the Wing Daya is protecting it with the appropriate arts, that this is kind of an attempt at cultural control of Japan, and seemingly everyone on the island wants to see these destroyed. The exhibit includes several terracotta warriors, which are kind of mentioned in other places to be kind of the secret army that Qin Shi Huangdi has backing their rule. The Sunwind want to blow it up. The NWO want to create a set of strategic theft and vandalism to kind of weaken these traditionalist forces. We get a plot hook over a fight with a bunch of islands between Russia and Japan. The Japanese Shen recognize that they want to prevail in this, but it could cost them too much. So how to dial that in? We then get a bunch of information on the Zaibatsu in Japan, which is listed as the Japanese technocracy, where all the conventions work under one roof. They hoard technologies and information. Visitors to the island are constantly being watched. They are viewed as backwards, but they view the technocracy as being reckless. It suggests that ugly buildings that are out of harmony sap vigor, making the people more pliant. Strange flows of chi through the island cause some people to be brimming with ideas while their cubicle mate is just sapped of energy. That later buildings were a combination of elements, and that has created confusing and odd flows of energy. The financial markets of Tokyo are also a place of warfare in that it is 12 hours off roughly from the west. That financially inclined vampires play in the U.S. markets while the rest of Japan sleeps. The Etherites are here for pre-scientific theories. Give me more information about that. We get the spirit of Mount Fuji that speaks very, very slowly. Went through 300 years of pleasantries and then 50 years of clarification. I like the idea that you have a spirit-inclined character that is asked to take over these negotiations because the person currently in charge is dying of old age.
And it also said in the dreaming for that, and that makes no sense.
I wanted to hear
the Kuijin are going in the dreaming to talk to the. What?
I think it's given how we had something about the yin dreaming and the yang dreaming earlier. I think the authors maybe misinterpreted the yin and the yang world as being like dreaming things, and so that makes the connection.
We get the idea that Japanese toys themselves are a strong force of banality, but that is fought back against because fans take their backstories and come up with detailed stories involving them, spurring imagination. And then finally, we get Borishima Kira, who is a risen business tycoon. I thought all of these were neat. Pick one. Again, plot hooks seem odd. And then we got a notes page.
Why do they keep doing these? Who uses the notes page in their book?
Yeah, I think in my head, that is so that they come out with the 96 pages that you need to have 4 24-page folios, because there's one Mage book that has 3 of them. And I'm like, that's a lot of notes. I could see having that, but I think almost all of us did the thing where you used a piece of loose leaf paper and then just shoved it in the back.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I don't have the notes page in my copy.
In your Dead Tree copy? Were you on the PDF or the Dead Tree copy?
I have a Dead Tree copy. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't check.
Oh, they stuck it in the PDF? That makes even less sense.
Yeah.
And that was supposed to be the character sheet for Land of 8 Million Dreams.
Go figure. Can I also just point out that woven through this chapter are also like little cultural asides and setting notes, my favorite of which is the second to last, that gives you difficulty adjustments for doing etiquette things if you are a shapeshifter currently in a non-human form, like how to do etiquette when you're in Krynos or Glabro, which is wonderful.
It is. That's a useful thing, and I'm like, why do I have to go to Tokyo?
The resonance rules in Fallen Tower, Las Vegas. Yeah. So any thoughts on this chapter? I mean, it was absolutely dominated by Wraiths, what for it being a Wraith supplement. This felt like it was both too much and too little, where it's like, oh, let's come back and explain how everything is fought over the Shadowlands. I would have wanted more hooks throughout the book explaining how different groups are engaged in the war, because I am perfectly fine with saying, oh, Tokyo is a city where the most interesting things happening are in the Shadowlands. Here's how it pulls everyone else in.
Flowcharts would have helped.
Yeah. I feel like this chapter almost could have been broken up and put throughout the other chapters. It might have been easier to just follow everything that way.
And then just have a plot hooks chapter.
Yeah. Or some other thing. Like,
And some of these feel so disconnected from even the other words directly around them. Like the section with the Kumo spiders, I was like, I love these guys, but how does this apply to anything that you've been saying about the Wraith stuff? Like, I feel like the book does that a lot, right? Where it'll drop a thing and I'm like, clearly the developer knew nowhere else to figure out to put this couple of sentences.
Yeah. Also, in reference, Terry, to your talking about stepping on all toes at once, I don't know enough from the intercultural perspectives of like China and Japan in particular, how the sort of Dark Kingdom of Jade storyline about the occupation, the resistance, that is a very fraught thing in real world history. That being said, Wraith has frequently treated fraught things in history with, from my understanding, maybe better than average at World of Darkness levels.
Given the 20th century history, at least, and the fact that China never successfully invaded Japan, I think it's less.
Yeah, this is a weird inversion of what happened in actual history.
Yeah,
where you had the Japanese control over large portions of China, or pardon me, heavily populated portions of China. But yeah, I am not an expert in the topicality by any means.
Fundamentally, all of the little individual story hooks were things I would be much happier to use than that overarching kind of theme.
Yeah. If this was World of Darkness Soul, maybe that might have been a bit less. But, that would have been, or at least making more sense.
The interesting thing to note about that is the Korean World of Darkness community, which is quite large, have collectively said, we are ignoring everything produced for Asia in the World of Darkness.
Sensible.
And instead have made their own World of Darkness books, one that is canon, ignoring everything that was produced that reference Korea or the rest of Asia.
Do they metaphysically go more with the Western world or the rest of World of Darkness, or do they like do their own thing?
No, everything is all the Canaanites, so all the vampires are Canaanites, right? They are not, Kuijin. Same thing with the reference to changelings, right? They were just like, none of that stuff that was written. So,
right on.
And with that, do we want to talk about our thoughts overall on the book? And if so, who would like to start?
Like you said multiple times, this is a Wraith book, and it says World of Darkness on it. It's not all bad. Like, there's definitely interesting stuff, but like, it's just one of those books I don't know if I'd recommend picking up, especially if you're not running a Wraith game. It doesn't really do much that you couldn't just do yourself better, I think. Changeling for sure. I don't know.
This to me felt like one of those books where at best I would rate it for spare parts. The centering of Akihito obviously has not aged well. That's not the book's fault. I'm not going to claim that at all. I do think it has a bunch of fun setting bits that you could add and that you could throw anywhere in East Asia. The stuff about clubs, I could put anywhere in the world. Again, there's a big history section. We don't get a lot of information on how to gamify it. It does do the thing where a city book makes a place unique. We get notes on Japanese religion, that there are 200,000 cults and their offsuits. The effigy lords is kind of fascinating. But again, the thing that I find interesting is, except for some of the Wraith stuff, any of that material could be put anywhere.
Yeah.
I would love to take the Red Soviet Syndicate Mage and just plump them down somewhere. What happens when you find out your antagonist in your New York game was formerly behind the Iron Curtain and kind of longs for the days of central planning, and that is their modus operandi within the Syndicate? I think that's interesting and perfectly fine. As someone who doesn't play anything with Land of 8 Million Dreams, I'm perfectly comfortable grabbing one of the Hissien there because it's fully statted out. It's the only place that we get any, and kind of putting them there. There are a bunch of key characters where we don't get character sheets for them. If I do play with a metaplot event where a massive earthquake causes a 6th great maelstrom and suddenly the occupied territories of China, outside of China, aren't as readily controlled, I am kind of going to need a character sheet for the head of the occupation, unless I presume that he is one of the first casualties there. The breakdown within Japanese society, I would be very hesitant to use, just because cultures have changed in the past 30 years, and generally how we present others has become a bit more nuanced. But I mean, that's going to apply to just about any book. But is this something where if it's 60% off on a World of Darkness sale, that I would recommend somebody gets it and they might get 5 good ideas from thumbing through it? Yeah, I have no problem with that. The art is wonderful. We get a lot of really interesting and compelling art pieces. It's a good peek into what the politics of the Shadowlands could look like. To get that for Stygia requires 4 or 5 books, where this is a good encapsulation of what that kind of politicking can kind of look like. I think the characters all have interesting backstories. In fact, their backstories are frequently more interesting than what the characters are actually doing. So yeah, this goes in the keep it in the bin to raid for spare parts. Remove the word Tokyo from the front and just make it World of Darkness place, and you can run through it from that.
Yeah, my thoughts are really similar to that, Terry. Like, I've read this book multiple times, and every time I feel like I've forgotten everything I read about 10 minutes after I put the book down.
Some books the text has arcane.
And it's not a good toolbox book, right? Like, I have literally taken pieces of this and used it for my werewolf game where my players are in Japan right now, but they're in Osaka, because I didn't want to place it in Tokyo because I thought this was not good for that, right? It doesn't actually give you enough to make Tokyo feel like its own place in the World of Darkness the way it's written. It's not super insensitive in general, in my opinion, which is always a plus for a World of Darkness book. But it doesn't stand out either as really like well developed in regards to culture or people, right? And from a werewolf perspective, this book is completely useless unless you're going in and taking those NPCs that are provided and using them somewhere else, right? Because there's basically nothing you're going to get from Werewolf from this book.
I agree with the idea that it's basically useless, except for the fact that it's the only 2 stat blocked Xian that we get in like the canon system.
And then they're also Yugen 8.
Oh yeah, but like, you know, for anyone who prior to Xianfan's book coming out, this was the only example of like how to actually create a storyteller character that had a backstory and options for integrating into a game.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many missed opportunities I feel in here. Like, I wanted a bunch more about the Tomorrow Garden, or about the kinds of alliances between the Fae of Japan with the other supernaturals. It's being a Wraith book really shows through in that sense. And then, as Lola and Josh said, having more about the history and the culture kind of woven in a non-exoticizing way would have been nice. The geography section was fine. I would have liked to see more supernatural hooks rather than just like, here are some places. But I assume most of this information came from a tourist guide or whatever. I can't envision really using it that often, but maybe once in a while flipping through and having an idea dislodged by the flipping of pages.
Yeah, the Tomorrow Gardens to me were particularly fascinating, which is the idea that there is this particular park that has these bubbles kind of coming through from the dreaming that was supposed to represent potential futures for Tokyo. I like the idea of having a shattered penumbra or something like that. And that is what makes Tokyo weird. But again, that is something that you can take and put in any city in the world, that there was a technocrat attempt to harness the dreaming to improve ideation. And that resulted in this weird fracturing of things where that allows your game to suddenly do a retro future game or an anime robot game or a high fantasy game, all set in the same place, but kind of bounded within the penumbra or this weird horizon realm that kind of got attached to the collective unconsciousness of the local area. I tend to be more forgiving of books, and this gives it a firm meh.
Yeah. That's sort of my thing. Like, yeah, there's some World of Darkness books where there's amazing parts and parts that make you very upset and wish that never existed. This has neither of those. It's,
right. It's just a good meh book. Yeah.
Meh plus. And again, this is frequently this is a different writing style than we are used to in contemporary books. This is a book that had a big lift to do, especially when you're describing one of the largest cities on the face of the planet. In terms of total population, where it's like, depending on how you do the math, it's like, 14 million people live here. It's going to have a crowded underworld. And I get it. And from what I understand, there was some boots on the ground familiarity with the area, at least for Tokyo, but an outsider's perspective is only going to be limited unless you are a Tokyo scholar. So, yeah.
And even then, it's 1998. So even if somebody living in Tokyo their entire life wrote this,
yeah,
there'd be things that aren't applicable anymore.
26 years ago, right? If you want to play a historical game set in 1998, perfect, great, exactly what you need.
Yeah,
you're going to need to do some research if you're in 2024 Tokyo.
Yeah, where flip phones are cutting edge. Bring me back. The MP3 has just been come onto the scene. Computer hard drives are like 2 gigs. But anyway, so what's the World of Darkness Network talking about next?
Hong Kong is our next big book that we're going to be covering. And if you sense a inappropriate pronunciation of that word, wait for that episode for us to explain it to you. Why it's Hong Kong.
That's a bigger book, so
it has more.
It's a more problematic one in many ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Signing off for Mates of the Podcast, Terry Robinson.
I guess this is where I'm supposed to say, and I haven't closed my actual show in ages. What do I say at the end?
Just make up something.
Until we get an answer to the question of when will you rage around a bunch of wraiths, this has been Werewolf the Podcast.
I guess I'm not going to do all this.
No, that would be a little bit weird.
Yeah. So anyway, it's Josh Hilderup doing Changeling the Podcast. And also,
yes.
Hi, Puka.
And for Changeling the Podcast, this is Puka saying, "Ii yume mite ne."
What's that mean?
Sweet dreams.
Oh, that's cute. Okay.
Okay.
When it comes to peering into the dreaming in order to cultivate possible futures using bonsai, we rely on our own soothsay-steeped arboretum to get things done for the podcast, although the nature of fey magic is such that things don't always go according to plan. Trim too many leaves off your red maple, and suddenly the social media go down. Grow the pomegranate at a slant, and then it's nothing but scheduling conflicts for weeks. Prune the wrong branch of a miniature juniper, and now that ice cream truck is parking itself outside every time you want to record, blaring its unholy music at any time of day or night in all seasons. I may be slightly bitter about that last one. While we haven't thoroughly investigated all the possible permutations of small plant divination and fate manipulation, we will be sponsoring a study for very important Puka researchers to do exactly that. Supporting such necessary endeavors, along with our show in general, are our patrons, who get a shout-out of thanks, and include Derek, Torkidas, Elleris, Iabol, Jason Vines, Oreo, Raskaboos, Sanchigger, Sija, Simon Strand, in memory of noted Bog and Terry Robinson, and Victor Torre. If you'd like to join their ranks, please stop by www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast to sign up, or just leave us a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. You can also visit www.discord.me/ctp to take part in the many lively conversations we have around all things Fae. Hope to see you there, and until we do, keep on dreaming.